Hi, my name is Casey Given. I'm the Executive Director of Young Voices. Some of you may know Young Voices. For those of you who don't, Young Voices is a nonprofit talent agency for libertarian, conservative, classical liberal writers age 18 to 35. We help them get into the media. So that means editing and pitching op-eds, scheduling radio and TV hits, arranging public speaking events, and supporting our alumni like the wonderful Lexi Hudson, which we're about to hear from in a minute. We are headquartered in the United States, but we also operate in the UK and in Europe, thanks to my friend and colleague Jason Reed in the back, which I'm sure many of you know. So we like to come out here to London usually about once a year to gather our friends and our partners, and when we have a convenient excuse, which promoting this book, one of the first books by our alumna, Alexandra Hudson, is a great excuse to come out here. So thank you for coming. I want to give a special thanks to the IEA. Thank you so much, Sam, for your help, and I'm very glad that we have Linda, the chairwoman, here as well, so it's a great honor. We want to keep this conversation fairly short, just about 30 minutes or so. I'm going to ask just about 3 questions to Lexi about her book, and we will also want to have an active conversation as well. So if you have any questions, please keep them in mind, and I'll ask you at some point. Alexandra, welcome. It's so great to have you here.
Thanks, Casey.
Yeah, so your book is called The Soul of Civility, and it really explores how to bring more civil discourse into the free society, which it seems like it's lost in many ways. My first question is, one of the key distinctions you make in your book is about the distinction between civility and politeness. Can you explain what that is to the audience?
Yeah, so I argue throughout the book that there is this essential distinction. We often hear these words a lot today, but they're often conflated. People either want more civility in public life or want less of it, and argue that it's a tool of the patriarchy and people in positions of power to silence and oppress robust conversation. And I argue that, often these people conflate these ideas, whether they want more or less of it, and that we should disambiguate them. I argue that politeness is actually technique, it's etiquette, it's propriety, it's manners, it's external, superficial stuff, whereas civility is internal. It's a disposition of the heart. It's a way of seeing others as our moral equals, worthy of a bare minimum of respect just by virtue of our shared moral status as members of the human community. And that actually sometimes truly respecting someone, actually loving someone well, means being impolite. It means telling a hard truth, engaging in robust debate, broaching an uncomfortable conversation, a conversation that makes us or them uncomfortable. That's not the realm of politeness. That is essential to strong, authentic relationships and to human flourishing. I'm happy to tell the kind of origin story of how I came to that idea.
Please do.
So I was raised by, I came to my interest in this topic honestly. My mother, who is with my kids here in London with us tonight, watching them at home, she's called Judy the Manners Lady. So she is this internationally renowned expert on manners and etiquette. And so she raised my brothers and I in a home that was attentive and mindful to social norms and social expectations. And I do not like rules. I don't like being told what to do. And so I've always questioned these proprieties that my mother expected us to abide by. She taught us how to shake hands and look people in the eye and how to set the table and cut our food just so. And I hungered for kind of a moral underpinning for these norms and expectations. Why do we do things the way that we do them? And I asked her, why do we use forks at all? And other cultures eat with chopsticks or with their hands, and other cultures greet one another with a bow. Why do we do things the way we do them? And she said, this is just the way we've always done it. And I always hungered for more than that. I wasn't satisfied with those explanations for why we do things the way we do. Is it just because some Judy of another era, some self-appointed manners authority decided that we should do it that way? And if so, is that a sufficient justification to continue doing it that way? So I always hungered for that explanation and inquired into the nature and origins of our social norms. But despite my questioning, I generally follow these rules and expectations my mother asked us to do. She promised they would lead to success in work and school and life, and she was right, until I found myself in federal government in Washington, D.C. I took a role as a political appointee, 2017-2018, a very divided season in our world, and especially in American politics, and especially in Washington. I feel like my experience was in many ways a microcosm of our deep divisions and the world writ large and America writ large right now. And when I was in government, I saw these two extremes. On one hand, I saw people who had sharp elbows. They were bellicose, they were belligerent, they were hostile. And these are the people who were willing to step on anyone who got in their way between them and their objectives. They were ambitious and overtly willing to dispense with propriety and niceties to get what they wanted. So I avoided those people. On the other hand, there were people who were polished and poised and polite. These are the people who would smile and flatter me and others one moment and then stab us in the back the next. And that really perplexed me. It scared me. One thing my mother said to me growing up was that manners mattered because they were an outward expression of our inward character. And yet here I saw this profound mismatch between manners and morals, that I saw people who were well-mannered and polite, but ruthless and cruel. And so this experience clarifies several things for me. One, that these extremes in many ways define the extremes in our public discourse today. Those that are willing to just shout anyone down and step on anyone to get ahead. And those that are kind of like wanting to tone police and just kumbaya, polish over differences. But and I realized that while these seem like polar opposites, they're actually very similar. That both modes have an insufficiently high appreciation of the dignity of the human person. That the hostile contingent sees others as pawns to be steamrolled and silenced into submission, and the polite contingent sees others as pawns to be manipulated and discarded the moment they no longer serve their purposes. But neither have a sufficiently high view of the beauty and dignity of the human person and the respect that we are each owed and owed to other by virtue of our shared humanity, which is how I define civility. And again, that experience also clarified for me this essential distinction that I argue for throughout my book between civility and politeness. Again, politeness being manners, etiquette, external stuff that actually, at its best can be this thing that helps mitigate social discomfort. At its worst, can be a tool of manipulating others and undermining them, which is what I saw and experienced all the time. And there's just a difference between civility and politeness. And so civility is the disposition of the heart, an orientation towards others that truly respects them, that sees people in the fullness of who they are, and respects them enough to risk offending them, telling them hard truth, and saying to them that tell them honestly that you disagree with them. That's a way of saying I respect you enough to take your ideas seriously, and that means I'm going to tell you that I don't agree with what you're saying. I'm not going to patronize you and tell you that I agree with everything you're saying when I don't actually. So I argue throughout the book that we need to aim less for politeness, the appearance of niceness and goodness and virtue and tolerance, and more for true civility, the orientation, the disposition towards others that actually respects them, and risks making people uncomfortable in order to actually respect others.
So this is your second day in London and third event so far, yes. Third of four. So really making a Ferrari safari here. But one of the common questions that's come up in all of the two events yesterday is essentially people saying, shouldn't the right be more uncivil, or maybe they're might be getting confused of, shouldn't they be more impolite when it comes to questions like gender transitioning or whatnot, or in the past of like pushing back against socialism? Isn't in the realm of politics it right when you have the conviction or you're morally correct to be impolite and push back against your opponent? So I guess broadly I'll phrase it in this way: when is it civil to be impolite, and can you give some examples?
Yeah, it's a great question. We live in a world where it feels like nice guys finish last, and you have to be willing to do and say anything, whatever is necessary in order to win. And that is rewarded, the sort of zero-sum thinking and scorched earth mentality that is rewarded across the political spectrum. And I actually argue, the core argument of a lot of my book is about the instrumental benefits of civility, that it supports a free and flourishing society, it supports our democracy, it supports a tolerant and robust public discourse, it promotes civil society and social trust. These are all arguments I make about the instrumental utility of civility as opposed to settling with for mere plainness. But I also argue, importantly, that civility is also an inherent good. It is good in and of itself to see someone in the fullness of who they are and to respect them in accordance with what they are owed by virtue of our shared moral status and our shared dignity as human beings. And that is good for its own sake. And I was actually, during a retreat I was on with the Aspen Institute. This was in 2017, while I was in the heart of darkness and federal government. And I sat for a year of my life in a windowless office, asked to just be a body in a chair, not to think, not to question, just to take home my paycheck, fill out my timesheet, and go home. And it was just like utterly despondent and soul-crushing, and not to mention the interpersonal hostilities I told you about. And so the Aspen Institute invited me and other political staffers and people from nonprofits from across the political spectrum in D.C. to Wye River, Maryland, just outside D.C., to have a retreat and conversation about civility in American life. It just felt like a soul-refreshing oasis. And it was during a close rereading. And we explored questions like, what is civility? When is incivility justified? Can protest ever be civil? America, after all, is a country founded on protest. And there's a vibrant tradition of civil disobedience. Can that ever be civil? And we explored all these questions. And, on one level, it was such a refreshing environment because it was absent of these hostility, these extremes of the extreme tone placing and politeness, and the extreme belligerence and the aggression that I had experienced in government. That was just really refreshing to have honest, robust dialogue where we disagreed but respected and one another enough to disagree thoughtfully and well. And we never let the disagreement descend past the level of the ideas and of the argument. It never got personal, never got nasty, never got ugly. And that was just a beautiful, to exercise my mind and be reminded of that there was that higher motive of operating that was possible. But it was also a close rereading of Dr. King's letter from Birmingham jail that really hammered home for me the crux of true civility and the core argument of my book, For Civility, that actually gave me my title, The Soul of Civility. Raise your hand. Anyone in this room read Dr. King's letter from Birmingham jail? Just a handful of you. I encourage all of you to leave tonight and go read it. It's a really powerful argumentation for, when is it appropriate to depart from politeness in order to communicate and speak truth to power in accordance to higher moral principles and values. And of course, he wrote this letter from sitting in a jail cell in Birmingham, Alabama, after leading a protest against racial segregation and during the Jim Crow era in American history, a very ugly era of American history. And several white pastors had written to him saying, "Stop protesting, stop ruffling feathers, stop rocking the boat. Like this, you're making everyone uncomfortable. Just be a little bit patient, be a little bit polite and nice." And Jim Crow will end eventually. Don't worry, it'll happen. And Dr. King said, no, the time is now to talk about these deep inequities and these deep injustices in our world, and I'm not going to stop. And so it's an extended commentary against just settling for politeness and for, in many ways, true civility. But in this letter, he makes an argument against racial segregation. And again, the Jim Crow era of American history had literally relegated African Americans as like a subclass. There were laws and norms that said, you sit at the back of the bus and whites sit at the front, blacks sit at the back, whites sit at the front. Like blacks drink from this fountain and go to this school, and whites drink from this water fountain and go to this school. And business owners would not allow, if they didn't want to, allow people African Americans into their establishment. When it was totally permissible for a long period, it was a horrible season of American history, and it ended largely thanks to Dr. King's approach of nonviolent civil disobedience. And he makes an argument about segregation in this letter from Birmingham jail that ended up being very influential on me in my argument for civility and against incivility. He says, segregation, treating another human being as inferior based on one aspect of who they are, and for any reason, it actually hurts both parties. It hurts the segregated by giving them a false sense of inferiority. But it also hurts the segregator by giving them a false sense of superiority. He says it deforms their soul. And Dr. King, he was a real student of what I like to call the great conversation, the iterative dialogue of thoughtful people across history and culture who drank from the same intellectual well and were riveted by questions of origin, purpose, and destiny. And in Dr. King's letter from Birmingham jail, he quotes philosopher Martin Buber, he quotes Thomas Aquinas, he quotes Socrates and other great thinkers from across the great conversation who didn't agree on these questions of origin, purpose, and destiny, but that's what makes it a dialogue, a debate, a conversation. And so Dr. King, in making this argument about an observation about segregation, he's borrowing from many people, thoughtful people who had come before him. For example, Socrates made a similar example, similar observation. He says that virtue is its own reward, vice is its own punishment. He says a symptom of an unjust, a disordered soul is someone who acts with injustice and indecency towards others. And that is its own punishment. A person who acts with injustice towards others reveals themselves to be a unjust soul, and that is a sick soul. And that is a soul that we should have compassion on and feel sorry for. And then Socrates says virtue, a virtuous soul is a soul that acts with justice towards others. And that is a healthy and flourishing soul, and that is its own reward. And Socrates is, Dr. King is borrowing from this idea of treating others well being its own reward, and treating others with indecency is its own punishment. And I realize that the same is true for the purposes of my argument and civility, that when we act with cruelty and malice and vitriol, even violence towards our fellow human beings, people we deeply disagree with, we don't often realize that we're hurting the other, but we insufficiently appreciate that we hurt ourselves too. We make both parties, we dehumanize the other, but we make ourselves a little bit less human and a little bit less humane as well. But the inverse is also true. Acts of civility, of charity, of kindness, of hospitality, that is mutually ennobling. It elevates both parties and makes both parties, both giver and receiver of these gracious charitable acts, more human and more fully humane as well. So, my response to the sort of, is there any utility to civility, or is it like a handcuff that is a barrier to success in life today? A lot of my book is about the utility of this mode of conduct that treats others with decency, but it's also just good for its own sake, full stop.
Great. This will be my last question, and then we'll turn over to Q&A briefly. But this is very difficult for me, but I'm going to put on a Marxist hat here and play devil's advocate and say, isn't civility kind of a bourgeois concern, in the sense that if you're poor, if you're struggling, if you're trying to make ends meet, you're just trying to feed your children. You're just trying to get them to school. You're trying to keep them away from, crime, from gangs. Civility is the last thing on your list. So why should the poor be concerned about civility? And how can we incubate civility in a class system, again, my Marxist hat, that is where people feel increasingly alienated from the elites, from the political establishment?
It's a great question and a great conversation to have, because that is a really vocal critique today, right? I mentioned these two camps. This one camp that wants to revive civility and politeness wholesale. They think it's this panacea to revive a season of comity and harmony in public life, and they often harken back to this era of a golden era of gentility. And so they say we need more civility and politeness to restore public life today. But there's another contingent that says no, that we need less civility and politeness, that these are tools of the people in positions of power that are keeping us powerless, and we need to just burn them all down, cast them all out, so there's greater justice and equity in the world. And I have a whole chapter in my book on civil disobedience, showing how civility, as I define it, has been this tool of promoting justice and equity for the downtrodden, for the oppressed, for minorities, for dispossessed peoples across history and across culture. I argue that, to this point, I love etymology. I love the story of language and the stories of words, and the etymology of civility and politeness supports this often underappreciated, this often overlooked distinction between civility and politeness. So the etymology of politeness is polere, which is the Latin word to smooth or to polish, and that's what politeness is and does. It's superficial, it's external, it papers over difference, sweeps it under the rug, as opposed to giving us the tools to grapple with difference head on. Whereas the etymology of civility is civitas, which is the Latin root of our word citizenship. Civilization, citizen, and the city. And that's what civility is. It's the duties, the mores, the habits, the conduct befitting a citizen in the city. And that sometimes that requires disagreeing, that it requires protest, that requires speaking truth to power. And I talk about William Wilberforce. I talk about William Lloyd Garrison. I talk about Frederick Douglass, Gandhi, Henry David Thoreau, as well as Dr. King, who I've already mentioned, as these examples of people who saw this project of fundamentally respecting others as the moral underpinning that promoted their efforts to promote social change in society. William Wilberforce, the famous English abolitionist, said, my life before me, I have two vocations, two goals, two passions: the abolition of slavery and the reformation of manners. He saw the project of abolition and manners as hand in hand. He wanted a fundamental societal orientation, a fundamentally humanistic orientation that appreciated the dignity and high view of the human being. And that motivated him to, he was a very privileged, very elite person, and that motivated him to do the dinner party circuit and to speak on behalf of these dispossessed, enslaved African people who had no one to speak for them. But that was like what he informed by his faith, informed by his philosophical, ethical, theological underpinnings. That is what promoted him to do what he did and have a hand in ending slavery in the British Empire.
Fabulous. Well, let's get to questions. We'll do a speed round of questions so we have plenty of time for drinking. Yes, you over there, sir.
I'm afraid you riled me up because you mentioned Marxism. My wife, some relatives were raked to death by the Marxist butchery of Stalin's army in World War II. And Marxists weren't liberators, they were exterminators, like the Nazis. They murdered 5 times as many as the Nazis. And I find that offensive, and I think that your idea of civility is great amongst friends and disputes with honourable people. And I think Martin Luther King is one of my heroes. And you can do it peacefully like Gandhi, that's great. But when my wife was terrorised by the Zomo in the Soviet-occupied Poland, you don't do civility with Zomo. They murder people. They kick into people's doors and murder people. You don't say, would you like to come and have a cup of tea? There are situations. America's democracy, very imperfect, but he worked in a democratic framework, he could put his corner. You try doing that in Nazi Germany or Soviet Russia, they'll exterminate you. You have to fight, you have to kill before they kill you. I'm sorry, I don't buy your argument when in those situations.
No, it's a great point and a great question. This did come up yesterday. Like when is departing from even civility, basic respect for personhood and human dignity justified? And we talked about instances like why did civil disobedience work in the case of Gandhi, in the case of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. It was because they were up against a largely liberal democratic ethical regime that cared about human dignity, cared about us, even though it lived up to its ideals personally and imperfectly. It cared aspirationally about ideals of equal personhood, the rule of law. But the same can't be said for regimes around the world today or in the past. And I think you're absolutely right that how would Gandhi or Dr. King have fared in Stalinist Russia or the Third Reich, right? Like that civil disobedience failed in many instances there, tragically. And this is why we did talk about this last night, and I do talk at length about Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was one figure as a part of the resistance, the Nazi resistance, and he was a German theologian and a professor who was from Germany originally, taught in America, and he actually chose to leave the safety of America and come home to Germany and be part of the plot to assassinate Hitler. And he had deep moral qualms about that. That gave him deep pause. He was a Christian, he was a theologian, he was a Protestant, and he took seriously the dignity and personhood of all human beings. And he said, can I morally, ethically, spiritually, religiously, can I really be upholding my own personal ideals while being complicit in a plot to take someone else's life, even if it unquestionably will save millions of innocent people? And he ultimately decided to be part of this plot to assassinate Hitler. That's where he came down on that deliberation, but he was never truly fully at peace with it. He had really serious qualms about that. And unfortunately, in the case of Bonhoeffer, it failed, his plot, and he ended up being executed for his part in the Nazi resistance movement just before the end of World War II, unfortunately. So I think it's an excellent point about the limits of civility. And what about in the face of monstrous regimes, dehumanizing regimes? What's the answer there? And I think, I do think, though, that if it gave someone like Bonhoeffer pause in that extreme example, in standing up to one of the most monstrous regimes in human history, if not the most, then we can have pause today. Like the enemies that we're dealing with today in the West are not on par with Hitler. And I think honestly that we use the phrase like literally Hitler and fascist. We throw that around too often, and it cheapens it. It cheapens the monstrosity, it cheapens the barbarism that actually occurred in the Third Reich. We're not dealing with anything like that right now in the debates that we're having. We're not, and of course, anti-Semitism is a horrible thing that's on the rise right now. But thankfully, we're not literally sending people to camps anymore like we have in the past. We're not sending Japanese people to internment. That's not a reality right now. So the enemies are not the same. And I think we can take inspiration and comfort and caution and wisdom from thoughtful people who have taken this question very seriously in the face of greater threats to our own moment than our moment now.
I was very beg to differ. Putin, CNN and North, that guy in North Korea, I would say that is going on now. I think that is going on now.
Well, that's a good discussion over drinks.
Yes.
Lots of questions. Yes, I'll go to you.
The old lesson. I'm happy to project so that everyone can hear me.
Yeah.
If you want to talk to the right person, it's also possible. So, the old lesson that every school child learns is those to whom evil is done, do evil in return. Now, those to whom evil is done, why do you think it's in their nature to be more retaliatory than civil, if it is supposed to be in our soul?
So wait, you're saying in the UK, children are taught to be retaliatory? What is that? What are you saying?
No, it's just the old lesson that people learn is those to whom evil is done, do evil in return.
Who's taught that? And who teaches that?
It's human nature.
So
like hurt people. kind of that.
In schools, people are taught that, or in churches?
Well,
like,
more in the playground.
Okay. So you're saying that's human nature? Is that nature or culture? Are you saying people are born that way, or are people cultivated and instructed in that way? What are you saying?
I'm saying that I don't think it's in our nature to be civil to people who do evil to us.
I agree. I completely agree. Part of my argument is that this is the most important question of our day. How do we flourish across deep difference? But I argue that this is, despite this being an essential question of our moment, this is not a new question. This is the defining question of the classical liberal project. This is the defining question of democracy. How do we peacefully coexist amidst differing visions of the good? But this question predates democracy and classical liberalism, which, as everyone knows, is relatively new in the landscape of human history. This is the defining human question. How do we overcome the selfishness endemic to our nature and thrive and become fully human in relationship with others? That I argue we are defined as human beings by two competing forces: love of others and love of self. We achieve our potential, we realize our potential as human beings in relationship with others. And yet, morally and biologically, we are driven to meet our own needs before others. And these two facets of who we are in tension. And that is why this thing called friendship, this thing called community, civilization, democracy, is always a precarious proposition. It is never a foregone conclusion. It is always fragile. And so, to your point, that every person, every generation has to be, instructed and cultivated, and every person has a role to play. I argue, to maintain this garden of a flourishing civilization, a flourishing community and society. So I agree with you. There is being social is in our nature, but also in our nature is this part of us that undermines the possibility of the human social project, and it takes a minute-by-minute, day-by-day commitment on behalf of each of us to commit to this thing called life together with others, or in the case of a democracy, to commit to this joint project of self-governance that binds us as citizens in a free and flourishing society. So to answer your question, yes, in short.
Great. How about we do this is maybe we can, since we have a number of questions and I want to leave plenty of time, maybe we can just have folks do the questions and then we'll have Lexi do one final response, lengthy response. So we'll just go row by row. Yeah.
So I've been very much with you until your answer to the last question when you turned against selfishness. So I wanted to hit on that for a minute. I think it's a faulty idea that unkindness, incivility, what was the word you used then? Violence, evil, all that stuff is selfish. It's actually destructive to yourself to be unkind to others, I think. So why are you posing selfishness and selflessness, or like kindness to others if you prefer, as opposites? Is it not in my interest to be in a flourishing society where people are kind to each other, where there's freedom and is that not all thoroughly in my self-interest to do that? And is it not in fact the rationally selfish thing, as opposed to the popular idea of selfishness as in abusive and climbing over others? I thoroughly agree. I hate that kind of personality. I think that's the unselfish thing to be. Is it not the selfish thing to be to pursue civility, to live in a just society where you treat others according to some kind of rational standard of good or evil?
Okay, can I propose rapid-fire responses to rapid-fire questions?
Sure, absolutely, yeah.
So, thank you for that question. I really appreciate it. And this is the hard thing about you coming to this conversation, as Linda said, without having read the book. So, thank you so much to Young Voices for hosting tonight and for gifting copies of the book to everyone who's interested in learning more. So
we got them in the back.
And I'd love to sign copies for each of you to take home so you can dig more into this. But I'll tell you a story really quickly. So that shows that we can make decisions that we think are in our self-interest, but are not, and that are short-term selfishness, but long-term loss. Okay, but that is and that undermine the human social project. So when I was in government, one day a colleague came up to me and told me how particularly radiant I looked that day. And also, did you know how brilliant you were, Lexi? And also, I happen to need some help. Would you mind helping me with this project that I'm a little bit behind on? I can't quite get to it. Could you please just, take a little bit off my plate? I was happy to help. And I didn't realize that he was actually expecting me to do the entire project for him. I was happy to help, though, lent a hand, and I gave him the work, and he passed it off fully as his own. Took all of the credit and all of the meetings, so with important people associated that he wasn't prepared for because he hadn't done the work, and importantly, after he had gotten what he wanted from me, gone were the pleasantries, gone were the niceties. I felt deeply used, and I was going to work with him. He was a colleague, right? Like, talk about short-term gain, long-term loss, right? Like, or short-sightedness, right? If he needed help again, I was not going to be as inclined to help him a second time, right? So this is an example of our self-love coming into and competing with and undermining the project of living well with others. And sure, to your point, it was short-sighted, right? Like, what would have been better is to have a collaborative, me helping him and then him thanking me and not flattering me and then casting me aside the moment I was no longer useful to him. And I will tell you that, unfortunately, a very beautiful and lengthy footnote got cut in my book about nuancing this in conversation. Like, I knew I was going to come up against thoughtful classical liberals, Hayekians who said, but how can you say self-interest is bad? What about enlightened self-interest? And so I had a whole conversation that, from Bernard Mandeville, the fable of the V's, private vice, public virtue, right? That we can single-mindedly pursue our own self-interest and still yield public benefits. And of course that's true. It's part of the idea of Tocqueville and Smith's idea of enlightened self-interest, that in pursuing what is good for us, we actually do pursue what is good for society. But that is not always the case. When we do acting in our own self-interest is at times zero-sum. We are acting in our own needs for the sake of others. It's not always that. There's definitely instances of and maybe I send that footnote to circulate for this crowd and make everyone happy. So,
I would say your rational self-interest is never in conflict with, but without the rational maybe.
Yeah. Thanks so much.
You're an objectivist, aren't you?
Casey.
Well, we are though.
No.
All right, so in
Nothing
the
wrong
spirit
there.
of the philosophic side of objectivism, I would like to ask for just a little bit of clarity. You mentioned in your definition of civility a couple of times, a disposition of the heart. I'm not really clear on what you mean by that phrase and how it would differ from, for example, a standing order or a philosophic premise.
A what? Standing order?
A standing order or a philosophic premise.
What do you mean by standing order?
A standing order is something that, like, you have it all the time. That's a sort of command you give to yourself to do on a regular basis.
Or a philosophic premise. Interesting. Well, the distinction I'm trying to make is external, internal. Like just doing the stuff versus having the inner belief. And in classical pedagogy, there's orthopraxy and orthodoxy, right? There's right practice that is often informed by right belief. And often right practice can form right belief, right? This is a very Aristotelian idea that acting with excellence and virtue can help form and cultivate virtue. But too often today, as in our education system, in our society, we're content with the doing and saying the nice things, the right things, and we insufficiently elevate what is the motivation behind someone saying this. Is this actually even respectful? We're too content with just people going through the motions and saying the right thing, or the quote unquote right thing. And my argument is that let's actually get our hearts in the right place. My book is in many ways a humanistic manifesto. It's extolling the gift of being human in these deeply divided times and what we owe the other, even when we deeply disagree with others. And that sometimes, and when we have our hearts in the right place, we're going to know, that's going to give us the discernment and discretion to know, when to stay silent, maybe when to be polite and not pick a fight, not, broach a controversial argument, and when it is appropriate. Like when is this honest and respectful to the other to speak a hard truth? When is this honest and respectful to myself? Because civility is a mutual obligation. It's a duty to respect the other and their person and their dignity. But it's a duty to respect ourselves too. When are we hurting ourselves? When we stay silent and don't broach an important conversation. So I think you'll particularly like chapter 3 on integrity that shows how that explores this mismatch between etiquette, ethics, manners, morals, from Jane Austen to Bond villains, right? Who are suave and sophisticated, refined and cultured, but planning world domination, right? The Hannibal Lecter problem, listening to classical music and sketches of Florence in the background while he's flying eating someone alive, right? Like good taste and even good education and polish and refinement is not a substitute for good character. And that is the distinction I'm trying to make. Like, let's cast aside the trimmings and focus more on the character and the internal orientation towards others.
I think that's probably a good place to leave it. So, like Lexi mentioned, we have free books in the back, and she will be sticking around if you want to get them signed as well. But thank you so much for coming. And I just want to point out my colleague Jason Reed. If you're interested in perhaps joining our program, if you're an aspiring young writer, we would love to talk to you. So thank you so much. Enjoy drinks. Cheers.